We are in Genesis 35. Slowly but surely making our way through Genesis. Genesis 35 tonight. Was there a place in your past or present of spiritual importance to you? Was there something that made that place so meaningful? One of the important places for me growing up was in Worthington, just outside of the campgrounds. If you follow the walking path around the campgrounds, you'll eventually come to a place where there's this kind of wooded area, and there's an unpaved path that shoots off the main path and brings you to the edge of the lake. Kind of there's that little bay area that got split in two. Anyways, along that path is my spot. Growing up, I'd like to go there in the morning or mostly in the early evening to do Bible devotions. It was peaceful. I only heard the crickets and the wind and the waves, hitting the shore. Even now, I just have to think about that place, and it's just kind of calming and peaceful. Think about it, just the seclusion of that spot was probably what made that more meaningful for me. Here's another question to help us to connect to this chapter a little bit. How many times have you moved in your lifetime? What was your longest move? Julian, I bet you've got quite a few. 29 times. From LA to Singapore. Wow. Sure, or to Amsterdam. Depends which way you go, to see which way is the longest. Yeah, as a child, I remember moving twice as a kid. But I know my family moved a few times when I was too young to remember, as our family grew in size. In all, I remember moving about 10 times in my life. I think 5 of those were with Katie after we were married. That averages out to about 1 every 3.5 years. The longest one was either from Minnesota down to Tennessee or from Tennessee up to South Dakota, so definitely not as long as LA to Amsterdam or to Singapore. The shortest one was just down the street from the previous place. We in Tennessee, we lived in, they had this beautiful cottage housing for the students. Looked like it came right out of a Thomas Kincaid painting. And they first put us in the very end one, like out in the boondocks. The very end one. But then we had Chloe, and another kind of a townhouse came available to us more, further into that little neighborhood. So we just moved right down the street, and that was nice. Anyway, it's interesting how moving changes our lives. Never mind whatever the reason for the move is, the sole fact that we go to a new place and bring ourselves into new surroundings, it changes us. There are new joys to experience. There are past things to grieve. But it's also during those times that I think we tend to feel God's presence more completely, even if we don't really, even if we wouldn't really think about it or voice that. As we walk into new seasons of life, we're reminded of God's faithfulness and His care for us. So today we're going to see 3 main events in Genesis 35. We're going to see Jacob. He's going to move again. And in the process, he's going to come upon a place of great spiritual significance for himself. Secondly, we're going to see the death of Rachel. And finally, we'll see the death of Isaac. And at the beginning of these events, we should understand that it is also throughout all of these events that we'll see that God continues to walk with His people. God is always there. And that's our first lesson for today. Let's look at Genesis 35. Let's read it in its entirety. It says this, starting in verse 1. God said to Jacob, "Arise, go to Bethlehem." No, not Bethlehem. I saw Bethel, I'm like, let's just put a ham on there. Let's start that one over. God said to Jacob, "Arise, go to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau." So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, "Put away the foreign gods that are among you, and purify yourselves and change your garments. Then let us arise and go to Bethel, so that I may make there an altar to the God who answers me in the day of my distress. It has been with me wherever I have gone." So they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods that they had, and the rings that were in their ears. Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree that was near Shechem. And as they journeyed, a terror from God fell upon the cities that were around them, so that they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. And Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, he and all the people who were with him. And there he built an altar and called the place El Bethel, because there God had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brother. And Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried under an oak below Bethel. So he called its name Alon Bakuth. God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padam Aram, and blessed him. And God said to him, "Your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name." So he called his name Israel. And God said to him, "I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body. The land that I give to Abraham and Isaac I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you." Then God went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him. And Jacob set up the pillar in the place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone. He poured out a drink offering on it and poured oil on it. So Jacob called the name of the place where God had spoken with him Bethel. Then they journeyed from Bethel. When they were still some distance from Ephrath, Rachel went into labor, and she had hard labor. And when her labor was at its hardest, the midwife said to her, "Do not fear, for you have another son." And as her soul was departing, for she was dying, she called his name Ben-Oni, but his father called him Benjamin. So Rachel died, and she was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. There's Bethlehem. There we go. And Jacob set up a pillar over her tomb. It is the pillar of Rachel's tomb, which is there to this day. Israel journeyed on and pitched his tent beyond the tower of Eder. While Israel lived in that land, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. Now the sons of Jacob were 12, the sons of Leah, Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun, the sons of Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin, the sons of Bilhah, Rachel's servant, Dan and Naphtali, the sons of Zilpah, Leah's servant, Gad and Asher. These were the sons of Jacob, who were born to him in Padan Aram. And Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre, or Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had sojourned. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years, and Isaac breathed his last, and he died, and was gathered to his people, old and full of days. And his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. All right. So this chapter opens up with God's command. And his command is for Jacob to fulfill the vow that he made to God. So let's look at that vow for just a second. Turn back to Genesis 28 for a moment. Genesis 28, we're going to look at verses 20 to 22. Jacob has just woken up from his dream when he saw the angels of God ascending and descending on a ladder reaching into heaven. He names the place Bethel, which literally means the house of God, and then he makes a vow. So Genesis 28, starting in verse 20. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, "If God will be with me, and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you." Zero in on verse 22 with me. Jacob sets up a stone, and he says that it is for a pillar. In some translations, it'll say that he set it up as a pillar, and that it will be for God's house. So because this is coming in the midst of a vow, Jacob is saying that if God will act as God has promised to act, then he will follow him and he will come back and complete the construction of what he has just started with this pillar. And so coming back to Genesis 35, God commands him to go back to Bethel and to make the altar that he had promised to make. Essentially, God is saying that he has fulfilled what he has promised to do, and he continues to fill it. So it's time for Jacob to properly and officially recognize this. Now, Jacob had a great moment of faith back in chapter 32. Remember how he recognized that God had been with him and had showed him faithfulness and mercy, and he even wrestled with God, and God had changed his name to Israel? Well, Jacob had that great moment of faith, but he didn't maintain that faith afterwards, as we'll see in a few verses here. So God is putting an end, essentially, to Jacob's delay. It's time to forsake his old ways and to begin to follow God. And so God commands him that an altar is to be built where Jacob had promised to build a house. And this is how Jacob was supposed to build, or supposed to fulfill his vow, to build a house which would be essentially to establish a sanctuary for God. The most prominent feature in those days of a sanctuary or a house of God would have been an altar. So look at verses 2 to 4. What does Jacob tell his household to do in verse 2? There's three things. Get rid of foreign gods, that's one. Yep, cleanse themselves or purify themselves. And essentially change their clothes, right? Change their garments. So Jacob here recognizes that God's command meant that he had to forsake other gods and commit himself to the true God. So even though he had shown some faith to God over the last few chapters, he had still allowed idol worship to continue in his household. And it's obvious that he knew about this because he tells them to put away their foreign gods and their idols. Now remember that what Rachel had stolen from Laban back in chapter 31? It was his household gods, right? So we know that Jacob didn't know about it then, but he probably found out about it and knew about it now. He could have found out about it at least. But even so, it now appears that her purpose in stealing those gods was to occasionally worship them as well. And so Jacob says to put them away, right? It's time to get rid of these things. It's time to commit to following the one true God. The Hebrew gives more of the connotation of discard them, almost throw them away. He tells them to purify themselves, which may include ceremonial cleaning. And the new clothes may just be an outward symbol of the spiritual change or the direction that they're taking. And then Jacob says that they're going to Bethel to build an altar. How does he describe God at the end of verse 3? What has God done for him? Been with him. He answered him in his distress. It's been with him wherever he's gone. See, Jacob fully recognizes who God is, what he has done, and most importantly, that he has fulfilled his part of the covenant that he promised back in Genesis 28. And Jacob proclaims this to his family. And notice that he bases the actions to forsake idols and obey God on the foundation of who God is and what he has done. He calls his family to follow God because of God's character. That's our call to follow God as well. And this is the second lesson we'll pull out of this chapter. We follow God because of his character, of who he is and what he has done for us through Christ. Now verse 4 shows that his family obeyed. They get rid of everything, and Jacob buries the idols and the rings under a tree. I've always wondered if those are still there somewhere. Of course, we're not going to go digging up around the base of every tree, but that's what he does. The rings in the ears signified devotion and almost what's the word? like you were locked in a relationship with a certain God. So what the rings were for the Israelites in the law, it signified that they were owned by their master. They were servants, and so they said, don't put a ring in an ear unless you were committing yourself to that 7 years or so of servitude. Here it's showing that they serve a certain God and they're bound. That's the word. They're bound to him. And so they said, nope, let's get rid of those two. You're only following one God, and he doesn't require you to pierce your ear to show that binding. Now, how does God protect Jacob and his family in verse 5? Yeah, makes all the countries around them scared of them. He makes people afraid of them. He puts the terror of God on them. So this is a supernatural terror. Specifically, what does the end of verse 5 say? The people didn't do what? Pursue who, though? This is very important. Yeah, the sons of Jacob. So now's a good time to remind ourselves what happened in the last chapter. The sons of Jacob massacred a whole clan of people, the Shechemites. The surrounding cities may have wanted to take their revenge on them for this action, but God restrains them. He restrains them against specifically Jacob's sons because it was specifically Jacob's sons who did this act. So God doesn't restrain them because Jacob and his family deserves it, right? They had literally just killed all these people. God does it to uphold his covenant. He does this as an act of grace. And so Jacob and his family came safely to Bethel. Now, back in Genesis 28, verse 19, it says, he called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at the first. So we're reminded here of both names again for this same location. And the end of verse 6 in chapter 35 underlines the protection that God had given them in these circumstances. It says, all the people safely arrived as well. And so then this altar is built, and he calls the altar El Bethel, which literally means the God of the house of God. It's supposed to be the God of Bethel, but Bethel means house of God, so it's the God of the house of God. And 20 years have passed since he last came to this place. I was just when we were just flipping here, I was just realizing these 4 pages are 20 years of life. Isn't that crazy? 20 years have passed. And when he first came to this place, he was fleeing from his brother. He was fleeing the wrath of his brother. He had nothing more than the clothes on his back. He was by himself. He was alone. 20 years later, Jacob is in the same place. But is he the same man? No, he's changed, right? He's drastically changed. He has come back now with wives, with children, with servants, with many possessions and flocks. He's been reconciled to his brother, and he is following God. His situation has completely changed from one time visiting this place to this time visiting this place. And it's all because God has shown himself to be faithful to him. I want to pause and give us an encouragement here. We live in a day when we can have things almost instantly, and we can seek changes to happen immediately. We can become discouraged if an answer doesn't come to prayer when we want it to come to prayer. And sometimes the answer may never come the way we want it to come anyways. So we need to relearn the value of patience and the faithfulness of God. 20 years passed for Jacob. And one of the reasons I'm sure that God commanded Jacob to return to Bethel was to highlight how different his life now is. We should be encouraged that God is faithful and that he will work in our lives, even though it may take a few decades for change to happen. And for those of us who are stubborn like I am, it may take longer. God is faithful, and we need to be patient as he works that change in our lives. So that's up there for our second and fourth lesson. There we go. Look at verse 8. Verse 8 details the death of Deborah, Rebekah's nurse. Now, most likely, after Rebekah's death, Deborah may have gone to Jacob to continue to care for him, because she was probably the one who watched after him when he was a child. The nurse of the mother would usually be the one who watched after the child when they were the youngest. So she most likely came to Jacob when he was still with Laban. And Deborah must have been very old at this time, since Jacob was probably near 110, and Isaac was going to pass away here at 180. Deborah could have been maybe even as old as 170 years old at this point. The fact that she is mentioned, I think, even indicates that she was important to Jacob. Usually the death of the servants or the nurses aren't usually recorded in the Bible. So that this one is recorded kind of indicates to us that she probably had a more significant role in Jacob's life than we would think. She probably served him, maybe even advised him in situations. And so the name Allon Bakuth means the oak of weeping. The oak of weeping. So again, she was clearly important to Jacob. Let's look at verse 9. In verse 9, it says, God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram and blessed him. And God said to him, your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. So he called his name Israel. And God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you. The kings shall come from your own body. That land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you. Then God went up from him in that place where he had spoken with him. So God appears to Jacob again and blesses him. And what's the first thing that God does? He says, your name is Jacob, but now it shall be called what? Now he had already changed that name, right? So why is this name change happening again? Well, this is a reaffirmation, again, of the name change that God gave back in Genesis 32. God is confirming the change in Jacob, and he's also re-impressing the obligation to fulfill the covenant and the obligation involved in this new name. The change that began in Jacob all the way back in Genesis 32 has finally taken a hold of him here in 35. And so once he reaffirms the name change, that he's called to be different, that he needs to live into this new name, then God reaffirms the covenant that he had given to Abraham and Isaac, and that he gave to Jacob in Genesis 28, the first time he was at Bethel. In Genesis 28, Jacob is told that his offspring will be as the dust of the earth, and that he shall spread across the land, the entire land. Here, the blessing of fruitfulness and of multiplying occurs again. It covers the same ground. Much like God first gave Adam and Eve that same covenant, be fruitful and multiply. But here there's an addition. It says that a nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body. And so the blessing of offspring is reiterated to Jacob, and the greatness of that offspring is he's kind of clued into. The promise of land is also given. God specifically states that the land that was for Abraham and Isaac is now for Jacob and his offspring. And so this twofold covenant, both of offspring and land, that he first gave to Abraham, that he gave to Isaac, and that he now gives to Jacob, it's once again renewed. It's just across 3 generations, and it's even promised here to the 4th generation. This is another picture of God's faithfulness. He's communicating through this reaffirmation of this covenant his faithfulness and his ability to fulfill this. I mean, Jacob has seen his grandpa Abraham pass away. He was alive for that. He'll soon see his dad Isaac pass away. He has seen God sustain this covenant through these 3 generations, and he has the promise that it'll happen now into the next generation. He's being taught to trust in God's faithfulness and in his power to fulfill what he promises to do. So in verse 9 it says that God appeared to Jacob, and in verse 13, after having finished giving this covenant, God left Jacob. So in response, Jacob worships. This is a good thing to do when we come to God. He sets up a pillar. He pours out a drink offering and oil, and he calls on the name of God. Now, the drink offering symbolizes this worshipful celebration of this covenant, and the oil represents the worshipful consecration of the covenant. Jacob recognizes again that this must be the house of God, and he calls the place Bethel. So this up to this point has kind of been a reaffirmation. When the first time that these things were given, the first time he called it Bethel, the first time he came here, he was in an entirely different state of mind. He wasn't really following God. He was fleeing from his brother because of active sin. And now that he's come back to this place, there's a whole change now. He has dedicated himself to God. He has recognized his faithfulness. He has recognized that he has fulfilled his covenant, and he is committing himself in all of his actions to following God as well. So, verses 16 to 18, Jacob is on his way to his father at Hebron. And what's going on with Rachel? She goes into labor. Ephrath means fruitful region. It must have been a place where things were able to grow especially well. Bethlehem is in this area. And Rachel's labor is described as a hard labor. This literally says in the Hebrew, she had a hard time of it. And verse 17 follows this up with even stronger language, saying that it was extremely difficult. How does the midwife try to comfort Rachel? Don't be afraid, you have another son. Now, back when Rachel had Joseph, she prayed that God would add to her another son. And so it may have been comforting to hear that this prayer was answered. Again, this chapter is just screaming out that God is faithful. But this labor took Rachel's life. This is a very tragic note, especially tragic because of the name that she called her son. Ben-Oni means the son of my sorrow. Now, some translations will also say that it could be the son of my strength. And it's because that second word, I'm just going to put this in English. Ben means son. Oni could come from two different Hebrew words, one meaning sorrow, one meaning strength. Sometimes the Hebrew letters can look exactly the same, but how you pronounce those letters can be different. And so it could mean sorrow or it could mean strength. So your translation might have one or both, or you might have a little footnote thing that says one or both. But I would be inclined to think that this is son of my sorrow, because she is realizing that she will not be able to see him grow up. But Jacob changed his name to Benjamin, which literally means son of the right hand. Now, he may have done this because the first name could have been a hard name to bear throughout his life. It could also be because the right hand signified honor, and he wanted to show honor to his wife. The right hand also signifies good fortune, and Jacob named his son this because Benjamin is the first son born into freedom. The first 11 sons that he had were born to him while he was under the servitude of Laban. So ultimately, we don't know why this name changed, only that it did. But again, I'm inclined to think that it's probably both, that he wanted to honor his wife, and that this is the first time that he has a son in freedom. So Rachel died, and she was buried. And what does Jacob do? He sets up a pillar for her. He leaves there, and it is for the first time we see him called Israel, outside of God calling him that. There will be times of switching back and forth between Jacob and Israel, even in the next few verses, but it shows that Jacob is beginning to radically change. He is becoming who God has called him to be, or to become. And then we see something random. Look at verse, I think it's 22. Yes, verse 22. It's just one verse about it, and then we leave it alone. It says, while Israel lived in that land, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. Just kind of inserted into this random place. And we may wonder why we were told this information. Well, it helps us to understand Jacob's blessing in Genesis 49. So jump up to there for a second. Genesis 49. This is some 15 to 20 years after this event. Genesis 49, we're just going to look at verses 3 to 4. Jacob is blessing his sons. And he says this, starting in verse 3, Genesis 49, verse 3. He says, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the fruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. So it starts out really nice, right? Like, okay, something good is coming, right? Then we come to verse 4. Unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch. So Jacob never forgot what Reuben did. And it was because of this sin that he doesn't bless Reuben. And we looked at this last time, but I'll reiterate this again. So because of this sin, he doesn't bless Reuben. Simeon and Levi are the next two that he would pronounce blessing on, but because of their sin and their anger and wrath for what happened to Dinah, that they instituted this massacre of these people, he doesn't bless them either. And so he passes his firstborn blessing on to Judah, because he would be the next one in line. And Judah then, of course, we all know, is who Christ came from, who rose to preeminence above the rest. So yeah, Jacob remembers what Reuben has done. Reuben's blessing is taken away from him because of his actions back here in Genesis 35. And like we looked at last time, the three oldest sons are not given a blessing, again, because of their past sins. Now, without this instance in Genesis 35, we may have been left wondering why Jacob would not bless Reuben. And to add insult to injury, Reuben does this very soon after Rachel's death. So that Rachel gave Bilhah to Jacob and that he fathered sons, Reuben should have treated Bilhah as a mother. Instead, he defiles this relationship and defiles this family. This is an especially grievous sin, and it should never happen. And then we see all of Jacob's sons' names. The sons are listed according to their mothers because that's how they would be grouped and understood in that culture. They would be naturally grouped that way. And finally, Jacob comes home to his dad Isaac at the place where Abraham and Isaac had traveled. Isaac was how old? 180 years. Wow. Right? Never saw his dad until now. So he had come back. We talked about this last time. He had come back and, no, not last time, a couple times ago, and saw Esau, and they met, and Esau said, let's go back. And he's like, you go on ahead, I'll meet up with you. And then he travels, Jacob and everyone travels a little bit, and they settle for a while. So for some reason, we were wondering, why would he settle there? He did have a lot of possessions and things. He needed to be watered and stuff. It might make sense to settle for a little while just to get their strength back. But to settle for a few years is what they seem to have done. We don't know. Jacob should have. Maybe his father never forgave him. And we did talk about last time, when Jacob left, he was told by his mom, Rebecca, to not come back until she sends for him, that she'll send for him when it's safe again. She never did that. So when he first saw Esau, he was probably very afraid. But he still never got that, hey, it's safe to come back. So I wonder if he was maybe still afraid of how his dad is reacting. I don't know. At any rate, so just don't ever leave under those circumstances, and you should be good. Anyways, at the very least, we do see Esau and Jacob come together and bury him. So just kind of, it's further proof of their reconciliation with each other. So they're able to do that together. But again, this chapter ends just kind of on a few tragic notes for Jacob. His mother's nurse dies. Rachel dies. His dad dies. But we should remind ourselves of the lesson that we began with. God reminded him at the start of this chapter that he was with him. And even though we don't see God mentioned in the latter half of this chapter, the same lesson holds true. God is faithful. He is walking with Jacob even through these difficult times. And he continued to work in his life just as God continues to work in our lives. So again, this chapter for me, throughout all of it, just screams, God is faithful. Put your trust in him. He will see you through your life. Any other questions, comments, or insights into this chapter? Okay, that's all for tonight. Thank you then. Have a good week.